Um, my name is Steve Niemeyer, and I'm an officer in the LBJ School Public Affairs Alumni Association, and I'm glad to have you all here today. We have with us DeAnn Friedholm as part of our Alumni Speaker Series, and DeAnn is truly one of the stellar alumni of the LBJ School, and it really is a great honor for me to introduce her today as one of our first speakers in our Alumni Series, which is Alumni Speaker Series, which is a partnership between us and the school, and this is being webcast, so all you folks out there from Boston to Beijing, welcome as well. DeAnn has spent her years since graduating from the LBJ School working to improve health and social services for disadvantaged people. Her desire to realize President Johnson's vision has led her to Washington, and then to Austin, to South Africa, and back to Austin. She's worked for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she started as a presidential management intern. So for those of you students who are considering PMF now, Presidential Management Fellowship, definitely a way to go. She's also worked for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, the Texas Office of State-Federal Relations in Washington, as well as some of the best-known Texas political leaders of the past 3 decades, including Governor Mark White, the late Governor Ann Richards, and the late Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock. DeAnn was Texas Medicaid Director for 3 years under Governor Richards and Governor Bush, and back then the Medicaid budget was $9.6 billion, and it's about $16 billion now. So Governor Richards also named DeAnn her representative on the 1993-94 Clinton Health Reform Task Force, and appointed her Commissioner of Health and Human Services in August of 1994. When not in government, she's worked on political campaigns, built nonprofit research and advocacy organizations, developed statewide coalitions supporting Medicaid and CHIP. CHIP is a Children's Health Insurance Program, I'm sure you all know that, and consulted with public and private entities working at all levels of government. DeAnn has leadership experience in creating strategies for successfully accomplishing program improvements, as well as implementing reforms. For example, the Texas indigent healthcare system, numerous Medicaid expansions and financing improvements, the creation of the Texas Health and Human Services Commission, which is no small feat, and reforms of the Texas program. Her nonprofit work includes work at the Benedictine Health Resource Center, now the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and serving at the Children's Defense Fund of Texas, where in June 2001 she was named their first executive director. Based on her extensive knowledge and experience, she was recruited in 2003 to South Africa, working for 3 years as a consultant in the National Treasury as part of a multi-departmental task force, where she did a couple of things to restructure the social grant system and develop reforms of the disability system. DeAnn now works here in Austin as a principal with Health Management Associates, a national consulting firm focused on public health programs at state, national, and local levels. She currently chairs the Kaiser Family Foundation Selection Committee for the Barbara Jordan Congressional Scholars in Washington, D.C., and serves on the board of the People's Community Clinic here in Austin, and I believe their office is right across the freeway here. So, in 1992, DeAnn was selected by the LBJ School Alumni Association to receive the Distinguished Public Service Award, just the 4th alumnus to receive this award, and she did it pretty quickly after graduating too, by the way. And at that time, she was the State Medicaid Director. Please help me in giving DeAnn a big LBJ School welcome. The title again is From Texas to Pretoria, I believe, or something
like that.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Good afternoon. That wore me out. As my mother used to say, I can't hold a job. It is actually 30 years ago last month that I started at the LBJ School, which I find absolutely unbelievable because I still feel like I'm about 27. Which I am not. And I'm pleased to get a chance to talk with you and kind of share some of the experiences I had, and more importantly, I hope get to do some questions and answers. I'm going to talk about a few of the more fun, interesting, exciting things that I participated in at different levels of government, and then spend a little more time about my recent experience in South Africa, and then open it up for any questions that you want to ask, with no promise that I will answer. I actually love the LBJ School. I had a wonderful time here. I've made lifelong friends here. I came into the school with a very strong focus on health and human service issues. I knew that's an area that I wanted to work on. Unlike a lot of people that came into the school, I had been very active in political things since I had been literally in 9th grade. Starting out registering poor people to vote in 1968 and 69, which was shortly after the Texas poll tax had been ruled illegal. And then working on a political campaign for a person running for state representative in my hometown, which is Waco, Texas, and having him win, which was a big coup given the politics of where we were from. And we won because we had gone out and gotten people who generally didn't participate or hadn't participated in the process in the past. And so I got early on a sense of what it could be like to make a difference. And the member that I worked for, who I worked for his election, went on to become a member of the Dirty 30, which at that time was a very big deal in the Texas legislature, where 30 people stood up against the power of the Speaker of the House, who was ramming through what turned out to be highly illegal legislation, which lined the pockets of himself and many others, and he ended up spending some time in prison over it. But that included some great people like Sissy Farenthold, who then subsequently ran for governor, and that was a fun campaign to work on. But early on, I guess what I'm trying to say is I got the sense of activism and using your skills to try to forward progress and improvements for, the way I think about it, is the little guy. Trying to get fairer opportunities out there for people to be the best that they can in our country, and particularly in Texas. So all of that, I went into the University of Texas very briefly, got a degree, an undergraduate degree in government and history, and worked my way through school, paid for my way through school, which is no longer financially possible. But I did at that time, working at the Capitol. And so I spent 20 hours a week working in the legislative process on the House of Representatives side for the representative who I helped get elected. And that was a fascinating experience, but it was a time when women, and especially young women, just weren't encouraged to participate. And so I remember one of the first rules that I learned, girls, you'll find this, everybody will find this funny, is that never admit you could type. Never ever admit that you could type. Because if you ever let them know, then that was it. That would be your assignment for the rest of the time. I left undergraduate school in 1976 and spent a year actually selling antiques in New Orleans because I needed to raise some money. And then I came to the LBJ school in 1977. And it was just, our classes were smaller back then. It turned out it was the 8th graduating class of the school. I think that's right. 8th graduating class. Nobody's here to, Dave Warner's not here to correct me. And as I said, I came with a very strong interest because of my background in helping less privileged people, which was right in line with kind of the reason that LBJ had wanted to create this school in the first place, and of course all the great things that he put in place domestically during his tenure. It was a nice fit for me. So Elspeth Rostow was the dean that year, because the dean that I thought I was coming in under got stolen by President Carter to run the public service, the civil service and do a major reform. And so when I came in, Elspeth Rostow was suddenly thrust into the deanship, which turned out to be a wonderful experience as far as I was concerned, because one of the things that she did was she recruited Barbara Jordan to come participate as a professor here at the school when Barbara announced her retirement from Congress. And so my second year of school, I was very busy trying to desperately get my thesis written and many other things. And she cornered me right out here one day, and I had been playing racquetball across and was very sweaty and just really not a pleasant person to be talking to. And here comes the dean. She comes out of her office and over here, and she stops and she says, "DeAnn, I have something I need to speak with you with, and you don't have to answer right now, but think about it, and if you think you can and you want to, then please let me know, because I would like you to consider being the teaching assistant for Congresswoman Jordan when she comes." And I looked at her and I said, "Well, I don't need to think about that. I'll do that." And so I ended up helping Barbara put together her ethics class, the syllabus and the readings and such, and drawing the names, helping the dean draw the names of the 15 people who would get to be in her class. It was fortunate, my name got drawn. Never quite figured out whether that was set up or not. And went on to become very good friends with Professor Jordan until her time of passing in 1996. And that was an enormously rich, if nothing else had happened for me coming out of this school, that was an incredible experience. But as Steve mentioned, I was one of the presidential management interns coming out of the school. That was the second year of the class. This is how old this all is. And I went into the office of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which at the time actually was the Secretary of HEW, who was Joseph Califano. And 1 week after I arrived, all ready to save the world, change the world, Califano was summarily fired, and we got a new secretary, Patricia Harris, who was an African-American woman who had been running HUD for President Carter. And she turned out to be a delightful secretary. And so I started out as a policy analyst, but I found, and I was one of like 8 PMIs at HEW, which quickly became HHS. And I was very intimidated by this because I'd grown up here in Central Texas. I'd only gone to the University of Texas. I'd come to the LBJ school. I was pretty, not very worldly. And I had peers who were from Harvard and from Stanford and from Princeton and you name them. And so I was fairly circumspect about my ability. But as it turned out, I got quickly promoted to be the special assistant for the assistant secretary there in the secretary's office, the person who ran all the policy and planning and evaluation for welfare reform in that year, and then also the creation of the low-income energy assistance program, which, believe it or not, is one of the few things I've ever worked on that stayed in place. And that included getting to do things like the negotiations with the people on the Hill and writing her testimony for Congress. This was like a handful of months after I'd gotten to Washington, so it was very heady. And I also got to have an office that looked out on the reflecting pool in the United States Capitol, which is the kind of thing that you get after you've been there for a long, long time. And I had this lovely, small but lovely office. Well, long story short, you know what happened, and Ronald Reagan was elected. This is going to be a theme in my stories here, but Ronald Reagan was elected, and everyone I worked with who were presidential appointees disappeared on January 20th. It was like, they're gone. And I went into work on January 21st and found that all my stuff wasn't in my office anymore, and that I'd been moved to this small interior office space with no windows, a desk and a chair, and no telephone. That was it. And so I thought, I wonder if they're trying to tell me something here. Because I wasn't a political appointee, I was a presidential management intern. But I took the opportunity to, as you know, in those internships, you can often move to different types of positions for the experience. And through people I knew from Senator Vinson's office, I ended up at the Senate Budget Committee working on the first Omnibus Reconciliation Act in the history of the United States Congress. And my job was to sit on the floor of the Senate when they would go until the early hours of the morning with a calculator. And every time there was an amendment to an appropriations bill, I would put the numbers in. This is the beginning of my budget experience. Put the numbers in, and if it got close to the cap that the Budget Committee had given that particular area of appropriations, then I had to call Senator Domenici. And so I spent many an hour sitting in the United States Senate watching the guys do their business and using the little TI calculator. It was very high tech. I did not stay on at the Budget Committee, and it became very clear to me that I didn't want to live in Washington. I had been in Washington for a while, and so I left and went on a trip around Europe and taught school in Greece and came back, and then got a job with the Office of State Federal Relations, which was under the new governor of Texas, Mark White. And suddenly the shift in America was for people who were trying to do progressive things in government, the shift was back to the states. We had a whole new crop of progressive governors throughout the country. Texas had one of them. It was an exciting time. And representing the state's interests in Washington was an incredible experience. One, because you did a lot of work with people on the Hill. You got to know a lot of the key staff people. And you worked directly with people like the governor and the lieutenant governor and the speaker here in Texas. And so it was an enormously great growth experience. And my favorite story from that period of time, of which there are many, was Lieutenant Governor Hobby was coming to town because we had a huge fight going on amongst the states, the Rust Belt states versus the Sun Belt states, over the way that the formula for Medicaid would work. And basically we were kind of getting run over on it by the Rust Belt states. And so Governor Hobby came, and Texas delegation at that time was very powerful. We had the Speaker of the House, we had a lot of the chairs, and so Hobby came, and Sarah Weddington, who was my boss, said, "DeAnn, you have to explain this to Hobby. You have 2 minutes. Explain it to Governor Hobby, what the deal is." And I remember standing there, and I don't know where this came from, but I said, "I can't do that." I said, and I looked at Lieutenant Governor Hobby, and I said, "If you have 10 minutes, I can tell you about it. But if you only have 2 minutes, I really can't." And for some reason, he loved that. And so we started what then became a nice and long friendship over that. And by the way, we won the formula fight, largely at the behest of a lot of the strength of the Texas delegation to stop what was going on. So those were fun experiences. I came back to Texas. Governor White asked me to work in his office and run his Health and Human Services part or division in the governor's office, which at that time combined budget and policy. And one of the things that I would say to you is, when I went to the school, I was completely into the policy side. But I think it's fair to say that you really are handicapped if you don't really learn the budget side of any policy area that you're interested in. Because especially in places like Texas where money is limited and really drives almost every policy decision, you really need to understand that, master that, and if you can do that, that gives you entree into ways to having influence over policy. So in working for Governor White, we had a major legislative effort that was one of the more exciting experiences, I think probably in modern history at the legislature, which was the passage of the Indigent Health Care System Act in 1985, and I was the governor's point person on it. It was really Governor Hobby's baby. That's what he wanted. And so we ended up in special sessions. It was one of those events where it came down to be the last bill during the regular legislative session. I had spent the weekend coming up with alternative ways to finance it because Governor White refused to support a 5-cent cigarette tax. Does this sound familiar? And so we came down to the last moments of the legislative session, and the clock is ticking down, and one of the conservative members of the House who didn't want this bill to pass got up and started filibustering it with about 8 minutes left. And up until that time, honestly, they had always had this thing where the speaker would just stop the clock at the end of the session to pass whatever bills you needed. And they literally would like drape something over the clock and stop it. And I'm sitting up in the gallery watching with all my colleagues from the Lieutenant Governor's office across the way, and we're watching this happen, and he keeps talking and talking and talking. And they didn't stop the clock for the first time, like ever. The clock rang, it was midnight, the session was over, and the entire package that we had worked on for all this time went down the tubes. To say that I was upset is not to put it strongly enough, frankly, I burst into tears. And I was so upset that I went into the governor's office, looked around, went down the secret elevator, got in my car, and drove home in tears. So that's another lesson, which is don't do that. Because what was happening in the governor's office was the decision was being fought over as to whether he needed to call a special session for this particular one thing. And so I got a call at 1:30 in the morning to my house, woke me up, and it was the staff people saying, we've got a special, be here at 7 in the morning. And so we had a special session on one issue, which is really not a good idea to have a special session on one issue because there's no trading that can go on back and forth to try to pass this legislation. And it came down to what was perhaps the first really partisan for health care. It wasn't about people getting emergency services. It wasn't about pregnant women getting coverage during their pregnancy, all of which wanting to embarrass Governor White and keep him from winning something in this manner. And so this was when Representative Graham from the U.S. Congress is calling down to our members on the House floor saying, don't support it, don't support it. Votes were flipping back and forth. And on the third day of this special session, we ended up with a vote that was to table the whole bill. And there was a vote, and we prevailed by 5 votes. And then there was a call for the record vote. So they had a record vote, and we prevailed by, I think it was 1 vote. And so then they called for the process where they go through and verify the vote. And the guys literally line up and go down to the front and vote aye or nay, aye or nay, aye or nay. And it was tied. So in the special session, after all of this, we came down to a tied vote. And everybody turned and looked at the speaker, and the speaker's standing on the podium, Speaker Lewis, and he turns around and he looks at his parliamentarian, and his parliamentarian goes, and he turned around and he said, no, slams the gavel down, the bill passed, and we got indigent health care, which created the foundation of the county-based system that we have today. So those were fun and exciting things that I got to participate in, and the governor asked me then to head up something called the Health and Human Services Coordinating Council, which was the first effort at the state level to try to get a handle on the fact that we had 11 or 12 or 14 different agencies, all of which fell under this rubric of Health and Human Services, none of which ever coordinated, all of which were their own little fiefdoms. There was no planning across state government as to different kinds of health, different kinds of, I see you laughing over here, and I appreciate your appreciation of this. And so this was a council that had the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker, the chairmen of all the relative committees in the House and the Senate, some public members, the board chairs from the major agencies. It was a highfalutin thing. And I tried to run that for a year, and then the election of 1986, Governor White was unelected, and suddenly, in the middle of all of this work that I was doing, we had a new governor. And I decided that I couldn't work in that administration because he had run on a policy that said, I mean, his platform was that he could cut $7 billion out of the wasteful Texas budget, most of which would have been in Health and Human Services, and it was just something I couldn't participate in doing, and so I had to leave. So here's another lesson from my long and tortured career, eclectic career, which is you should always have enough money to have the freedom to walk away, if you possibly can. And I did. I left government and worked with Helen Fairby, who was a leader in Texas at the time on mental health and healthcare policies, and we created the Benedictine Health Resource Center. I worked with Helen and a small foundation that was affiliated with that, and that is now the Center for Public Policy Priorities here in Austin, which is really a great resource for people in Texas, and it grew to be a very strong thing. When I was running it, it was nascent, it was small, but it has turned out to be a really great resource in Texas. I volunteered then in the Richards and Bullock's campaigns in 1990. Did a lot of issue work for and for Ann, and traveled with Barbara, who went around and campaigned for Ann Richards to be governor. We had a lot of fun on the campaign doing that, and we're together with the governor on the Sunday night before the election, when her opponent had said, who was a rich oil man, had been asked about his income taxes. And this was this was back when times were tough, and he says, "Well, I always paid my income taxes, except in 1986. I didn't pay any income taxes in 1986, and here's a multimillionaire who didn't pay any taxes at a year when everybody else was really, really hurting in Texas because of the OPEC oil crisis." And so we took advantage of that, and that evening I realized we were going to have a governor in Texas who was a woman. It was going to be Ann Richards. And we did barely win that election. And then I had to decide what to do, because I'd also worked with Bullock's campaign some. And basically, I decided to go to work for the lieutenant governor instead of Governor Richards. And I did that for a number of reasons, primary of which is that I'd already worked for the governor, and I knew the limitations of the power of the governor's office in Texas. It's very frustrating. It certainly was then. It's, I think, maybe less so now. And then secondly, Bullock had talked to me very specifically about his support for an income tax for Texas, which I thought was vital, and the things he wanted to see happen in Health and Human Services. And so I decided to go with Bullock and work in the Lieutenant Governor's office. And that was the first year we had a massive budget crisis. Turned out I stayed very close with Governor Richards, and she would call me, and I'd get to talk to her about policy as well, so it was kind of a nice position to be in there for a while. But we had a massive budget crisis, and that was the first Texas Performance Review, which I think Billy talked about before, but it was the very first one where they did a massive review of state government and said, what can we do? And we worked with them to come up with a recommendation to restructure all the Health and Human Services. And so we had 3 special sessions that year and restructured 30% of the state budget in special sessions between May 31st and August 15th. I'll never forget that date, to restructure the way that state government operates in terms of health care and human services. And that experience yielded what was a nicely organized chart, but without proper power to the executive, the commissioner of that entity. And so it kind of struggled along for quite a while until it's been strengthened in the last 2 or 3 legislative sessions. But that experience and working for Lieutenant Governor Bullock was an incredible one, and we came out of that legislative session. We had a big tax increase to make it all work, and in January of 2003, Governor Richards' folks talked to me, and I was ready to get out of the legislative system, and I thought it was time. I had done that a lot, and it was time to go and work in the departments and try to get that kind of experience. And so I went over as the Medicaid director for the state of Texas at a time when it was in severe crisis in terms of growth and budget constraints, and with projections for Medicaid that just went out the roof and scared everybody to death, quite frankly, including me. And so I naively went over. Bullock said, go over there, figure it out, and we'll fix it. And I went in to that job replacing or following a person who had been the Medicaid director for quite a long time, and he was a double dipper. He'd been a military doctor, and then he had come back to work for the state of Texas government, and just hadn't really done anything for a long time with the program. And so I came in with this reform agenda, and states were doing interesting things, and basically started a 1.5-year process with wonderful staff, many of whom are LBJ students, to educate the legislature about the nature of Medicaid, the nature of the problem, the nature of health care issues more broadly, writ so that you could see why the Medicaid system was having the kinds of problems it was. And we created basically an education series for the key committees in the House and the Senate, and spent that summer before the legislative session, and I would do the Medicaid 101 show, basically, which was, I think, the first time the legislature had ever seen a PowerPoint. And it was really pretty fancy. I had a great staff person who really knew how to do it, and she could grow grass, and they would grow on the screen, and they were multicolored, and lines would move, and it was bells and whistles. And frankly, everybody came, all the members came, and they sat and they listened, and it was a fairly unique experience, I think. But we put together a major reform package, which was going to basically restructure the financing system of the indigent county system and take money that was in there, match it through Medicaid, and get broader coverage through the Medicaid system because it would bring down so much more federal money. And that became Senate Bill 10 in the 1995 legislative session. In August before that session, I was Medicaid director, and also Governor Richards had asked me to be her representative on Hillary Clinton's task force. So we were having a legislative session where Medicaid was the issue. I was a Medicaid director, and yet I was serving multiple days at a time in Washington on the First Lady's task force for health care. And that experience was amazing because there were 6 governors who the First Lady had asked to have someone on the committee. This committee was called the Secret Committee. I don't know if y'all have ever studied this or not, but it was the Secret Committee. And that was a very controversial thing. The membership was really unknown, except that every time you turned around, it was bigger and bigger. And it started as 200, and it became 300 and 400. I think it ended up somewhere in the 500 realm. And with multiple working committees that would work on particular areas, and then every other Friday night, they would have something called the toll gate process, where each committee would come in, and the First Lady and Tipper Gore and other key people would sit up at a panel and listen to these presentations and then give guidance to them as to which direction to go as they continued to develop this massive health reform plan. Our job was to be the sounding board, usually before they went before the toll gates, for any and all of these committees that had to do with the administration of health policy. And so we would listen to them, and they would say, "This is what we're planning to do. We're going to have the Big Bang Theory. We're going to have everybody have a health security card, and that card will be ready on July 4th, 1996." And my job was to say, "What? You want what? You're going to do what?" Now, the people from Minnesota and Vermont and Colorado and, some of those states were like, "Yeah, man, we can do that. Let's go." But we couldn't. And my job was to try to help protect that. And then I would come back home and brief Governor Richards as to what was going on. And so towards the end of that spring of 1993, she went up and explained to them why this was not going to work, why it was politically infeasible, why she could not support the package. And my participation kind of filtered out after that experience. And of course, we all know what happened, which was exactly what she predicted would happen. She named me Commissioner of Health and Human Services in 1994 in August, and I was very prepped and very excited. I had finally gotten to the job where I could have the ability to make big change and really help people in Texas. And as you know, in 1994, Ann was not reelected, and we had Governor Bush elected to serve starting in 1995. So once again, actually what happened was the morning after, at about 6:15 in the morning, and I had been up late, not celebrating, and with others, and my phone rang at 6:15 in the morning, and I answered the phone, and I said, "Hello," and I hear this voice. It goes, "DeAnn, don't do anything stupid." And I was like, "Excuse me?" I didn't know who this was. I said, "Excuse me," and it was Governor Bullock, and he said, "Don't do anything stupid. I know you like Ann Richards, but I'm telling, this is a good fella, and I'm telling him to keep you." So I was put in a position of having to decide, whether or not I could be the commissioner or continue in Medicaid even. And we had this massive reform package that I had worked for a year and a half on, with enormous numbers of people and staff, and with I thought a good way to help transform a lot of indigent care in the state. So I ended up, I had a meeting with Governor Bush. It lasted 1 hour and 17 minutes. The day after he was inaugurated, and we had a debate that went like this about the role of government in healthcare. And suffice it to say, we did not have the same idea about that. And so I was asked to stay on for Medicaid for the reform package, which I did do. And we did get that package passed. The legislature was all revved up for it, but it was never implemented. And I left government later that year to go into some consulting. So all of those kinds of experiences, put me in a position of, first of all, having to change jobs a lot, but secondly, a broad kind of understanding of the way things work in the policy-making process, and how to implement, how to write legislation, the role of the lobby, the budget implications of things. And in 2002, old friends of mine from the Senate Budget Committee, now this is a place I worked for 8 months, but I became very close friends with 2 people from that committee. And they, at this point in time in their career, were running this program out of the U.S. Treasury called the Office of Technical Assistance. And they called me the morning after that 2002 election when it was clear that the future of CHIP and Medicaid was not going to be bright, at least for a while. And they called me and said, hey, you want to go to South Africa and work with the South African government? And I said, what? And they said, we've had people there since 1995, and the budget's all set up, and the process works pretty well, and they're kind of finished, but they're looking for us to give them somebody who knows how to restructure and, rework social grant systems and, the way that they're administered and the way they're financed. And so these friends, were like, go see. And I thought, okay, you're going to give me a free trip to South Africa to talk to some people and maybe do this. And they said, yeah, because we think when you get there, you'll want to do it. And so I went and met with all of them and came back home and told them no, that I would not be going to South Africa because of the crime, because of the lifestyle that you were forced to lead in South Africa, in spite of all the wonderful things going on in the country. And so for a couple of months, I just kept saying no. And then I had a change of heart. We were in the middle of a legislative session, and I thought, I just can't do this anymore. And so I had a change of heart and decided to go. And moved over there very quickly after that and spent 3 years working in the National Treasury, where we went about the process of reviewing the system as they had it. They had, basically when apartheid ended and Mandela came in with a new government in South Africa, they took everything that was and left it in place in terms of grant systems and programs, which I would describe to you as a highly European type model, very much out of the Dutch, British, kind of background. And they had left it in place, but just took off all the racial restrictions and said it's not just for Anglos anymore, it's for anybody who qualifies based on poverty. And so they have an old age grant, they have a disability system, they have a mom and kids program type thing, they have a healthcare system of some type, and not like Medicaid, but they have clinics and systems, and they don't have food stamps. It's kind of the only thing that's not the same as here. And the restrictions and the low levels of coverage and things are very similar to here. But in South Africa, because people are so poor, because there's so many people who are unemployed, 1 in 4 South Africans directly receive a grant, and they believe 1 to 2 more actually rely on that grant in families. And so it's a huge issue. It was a huge, huge part of the budget. The reason that one of the reasons the government was trying to reform it was because the Human Rights Commission kept suing the government, class action lawsuits for anybody who worked and lived in Texas, this should sound very familiar to you. And they were getting class action lawsuits in the court, the Supreme Court, telling them how to run their programs. And more importantly, they weren't being run well. And that's really what the government wanted to do something about. So they had decided they wanted to restructure, bring the power to the national level, remove it from the provincial level, and rework their programs. And so I spent a couple of years in South Africa working with a task force of very high-level people in the national government to design that system, design that change, help write the legislation to create a new Social Security agency similar to HHS in Washington, and the Social Security kind of all wrapped up into one, but to create a whole new national department, which is what they wanted. So I helped work on that, draft the legislation. I got to participate actually in the parliamentary process, which was very interesting. This is a country with 45 million people. Their parliament is 400 members in the lower house and then 90 in the upper house, which is called the Council of Provinces. And they don't have any staff on their committees. They have, that's an exaggeration. They have one staff on their committee. And that staff person basically makes sure that the Xerox copies are made of whatever the papers are. And so working through that process, getting the legislation passed and setting up an implementation team, all of which was fascinating work. I don't know how much the fact that I was a female, a white person, an American, or / foreigner, but particularly an American, as time went on while I was there, it became less and less popular. And but it took a long time to get to a level of trust. But when I was able to, I was included in incredible, high-level conversations and decision-making processes about the way that they wanted to go. And so I'm going to stop there because I've talked too long. You didn't give me a signal.
You're doing fine.
And take questions. I could tell you all kinds of other things. I did make a presentation about South Africa and some of the work I did once before here, so maybe some of you heard that, or I'll do it some other time. But I do want to take questions if any of that raises questions, issues, thoughts.
Do we have any questions?
You mentioned you had changed different jobs, different locations. So how did you manage moving and settling in different places, and then actually getting to work? Was that a big challenge in your career?
Well, the older you get, the harder it is. Basically, you don't accumulate a lot of stuff because you always are thinking about how many boxes you need to move it. But in the case of like going to South Africa, they moved me there. I mean, I did nothing. They came in and boxed it up and sent it, and I just had to arrange to get my dog to go with me over there, which was not a small event. But going and living other places, I'm very much an Austin person. I've been here now since 1972, and it's home, and I've always thought of it as such, and I think it will remain such. And so the moving part of it is a challenge, but you just have to jump in. I mean, it's very hard to make friends in places like South Africa. Very difficult. And a lot of the reason that they wanted me to stay a fourth year, and I didn't stay a fourth year, predominantly because of crime issues. That's just so exhausting that at some point it's just, you just figure your odds are getting worse and worse every day that you're there, that something will happen to you because you've known so many people that have had things happen. But I socialized a lot with the people I worked with, frankly. And to some extent, some of the Americans who I had met over at the embassy. But I was the only person not in the embassy. I literally had an office in the National Treasury and got up and went to work there every day and was escorted from the parking to the building by guards and things like that. So is that answering your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so to be successful in a career in public service, it's part of the trade to be able to move easily between places.
Not necessarily. I mean, I have friends here who have been here, who started in the LBB, made a career in the Legislative Budget Board, had a fantastic career, had great influence. Billy Hamilton, who was here, Craig Peterson, who was here, Susan Reef, who was here before, did move and went back and forth to Washington a couple of times. So it really depends on what you want to do. But you know, I always wanted to be part of change that was happening to try to make things better, as opposed to thinking of myself as I'm a budget person. I was more interested in trying to go where I thought I could make some kind of difference, even if I ended up not doing it. Yes, sir.
Could you give us any advice on how to balance the loyalty to the party and your professionalism, as we're just telling about this bill? It was more a party thing than a professional thing to get care for all the people, because sometimes it's hard when you're in public service.
It's very hard, and you know, I've never worked for any party per se, but I have a philosophy that is usually better reflected in the Democratic side of the ledger than the Republican. I worked for Pete Domenici in the United States Senate, who's a Republican. Some of that just has to do with whether, I mean, to me, the judgment is, are these people who are trying to get to a place that I want to try to help to get to, in terms of policy. But that night, you know, when we won that indigent care fight, there was a big party in the governor's office, and I got to tell you, I was so disillusioned from that experience, because it had been such a great experience up until the end, and then when we went into special session, and suddenly it wasn't about poor people getting health care, and it wasn't about how counties are going to be funded or protected in what they have to put forward for indigent care. All of the issues went away. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was a partisan political issue, and it became one of those kinds of fights. And at the end of the evening, when there was champagne in the governor's office, and you know, the lieutenant governor, everybody had stopped by, and it was just a great celebration. Everybody was happy, and I went into the governor's office. This was in his office, where I went into the area where his desk is, and I picked up the phone. It was like 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, and I called Barbara Jordan, and I said, Barbara, you know, we won. And she goes, I know, I heard, I saw it on the news. Congratulations, you must be feeling great. And I said, I don't feel great. I am so disappointed that this wasn't, you know, people did this for all the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons. That's what I said. You know, they didn't care about poor people and let me get off, you know, I went off on this little, not a tirade, but, you know, I went off on that level, on that angle of it. And there was this silence, and Barbara goes, DeAnn? And she said, are poor people going to get health care as a result of this? And I said, yes. And she goes, they passed the bill the way that it would have been passed before? And I said, yes. And she goes, well, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter why people do things. And I think that's really important. It's a lesson that I learned, which is you make your agreements with people, you make your coalitions with people. There may be many, many reasons why somebody's doing something. As long as you keep your eye on the goal or the prize, you can stay in there. Otherwise, you need to really go be an advocate. And I've been an advocate. I love being an advocate. I love being an advocate. I love doing coalitions and organizing and putting together press conferences and things. But you know what? You don't have the same ability to make a difference hands-on like you do if you get to be in government and you're getting to work on things that you believe in. So the way I see it is, I don't care which party a person is if they're trying to get somewhere in the general vicinity. If you're being directionally correct, if you're making progress, then I think that's the way you have to do it. I mean, Barbara used to say, slog it out, grind it out, stick with it. You know, it's not pretty and it is not glorious. And every once in a while you get to win. Does that help answer?
Yeah, and I actually had a question and a comment. I guess the question is, you talked about that you had left after the 3 years and there was a possible 4th fourth year. So it sounds like there was still some work that needed to be done to the
Yes,
system
absolutely.
before you left. But I was curious if you would know, I assume you would know this, but if in doing, in recreating the system and kind of even creating, I guess, some of it from scratch, if they kind of put some type of evaluation tool as part of, kind of what they were doing to kind of look at what this new system, what the benefits of this new system has been, sort of how has it, have they had enough, there hasn't been enough time probably to have gone by at this point to really evaluate it. But I wanted to know if that was at least something that was kind of in the works with the Treasury, the South African Treasury.
Yes, I believe. Well, let me tell you. First of all, the very first year, once we got the legislation passed, which was 2000, end of 2003, early 2004, then the implementation started, and this task group continued to work on designing how to implement the transition, which was enormous.
Sure.
It's 11 million lives, and close to well over a third of the budget of the country, and so about 6 weeks out from the first budget where that transition was going to start. So like there was a year of planning after the passage of the legislation, then it was going to start that next budget. We went, oh my goodness, how are we going to know what's happening? And so I sat down. I mean, this is really embarrassing because I am not an expert in evaluation per se,
Sure.
but I sat down with some people from the department and we came up with like 12 indicators that needed to be put in place by the 9 provinces to start showing how things were changing. And you would have thought that we were asking for the moon. It was really something. And honestly, we didn't get reports back on those. By the time I left, we still had not received any kind of systematic, consistent performance measuring or evaluation at all. There's stated goal for it. Robert Clifton from here is not working specifically on
Right.
that area, but he's trying to help develop the whole concept of measurement and evaluation of policy changes or budget changes.
Let's talk to you a little more about that. 'Cause
Yeah.
I've been actually involved in some of that.
Yeah.
But I also, my comment, and that kind of is the perfect segue, is that maybe just if you have a few extra minutes just to talk a little bit more about the Office of Technical Assistance and your kind of, just the fact that this is an international program, that you have, there's resident advisors all over the world doing work in
Yes.
budget and finance, et cetera.
Yes. Why don't you go ahead? No.
No, I know.
No, what
Not
she's saying is that the Office of Technical Assistance, which is this office that my friends were recruiting me for, is a small unit in the U.S. Treasury, and it was set up originally when the wall came down in Eastern Europe. And we suddenly had, I don't remember, was it 12 or 15 brand new democracies out of the former Soviet Union, and they all needed enormous amounts of help in setting up a whole new governments, basically. And so Treasury they recruited people from around the country and sent people who I would call really budget people, which I do not consider myself to be, a solid, like a green eye-shaped budget person. By any, I understand budget systems, I've written budgets, I've administered budgets, I've, fought budgets and whatever, but I mean really like people who can set up charts of accounts and things like that. And so the program now, it originally started in those Eastern European countries, and the program now, I'm trying to remember, I'm hesitating, but I think it's like 25 countries that there are resident advisors working in, and it's not just budget, it's tax, it's financial institutions, it's debt, financial institutions like setting up banking systems, things like that. I mean, when you stop and think about going from a country that doesn't have any of that and suddenly overnight needing to have it, the amount of technical assistance is amazing. But we're fairly unusual compared to other organizations that do a lot of technical assistance, and heaven knows there are many of them, and many of them do fine work. IMF, World Bank, the OECD, lots and lots of groups. But one thing that's unique about ours is that we go in and we live there and we stay there and we work in the building. And that makes a huge difference in terms understanding and access, and building strong relationships, the ability to identify things that they need that they don't even know to ask for, and then garner those resources to help get people in to help. Because you're never going to be the only person. I mean, you can always find other people who can come in who know more and can be more helpful. So I think it's closed out of Eastern Europe about now, and I think South Africa will be closing out fairly soon. I was supposed to be the last person, but because of a very specific request and because we knew somebody good to go over there, it extended. But they're really moving to Southeast Asia area, to other parts of Africa, and to Central and South America. So they generally look for people who have a lot of experience. I mean, it's something for you to think about, 15 years out, or something like it, if it still exists.
Yeah, I had a question. This Hillary Clinton task force. And this is two parts. That one, there was the secrecy and everybody got all bent out of shape about it. But then, here you come along, how much later? 10 years later, and the vice president has a secret task force on energy, and his deliberations were able to be kept secret. So that to me is just, I don't understand that, but maybe the people, the composition of the Supreme Court, I don't know how it changed, but he was able to keep his deliberations secret. And the other thing is, nowadays I don't know if that's a comment or something, but I read a recent column by David Brooks, New York Times columnist. He's conservative, and he was saying that the Republicans used to have a certain way of thinking. They looked out for the common man. He was talking about Abraham Lincoln, but nowadays they're talking about free trade, and he says they've sort of missed the middle class. And he said the person who's really addressing these sorts of issues is Hillary Clinton. And I know for myself, me personally, I spend, in addition to my state of Texas health insurance, I take an extra $5,000 a year out through a PayFlex account. And I spend all that money every year for health insurance for my family. And I think for a lot of Americans, that's a huge issue. And I think she's, basically the one candidate who's sort of primed on the issue.
That's a comment. That's a comment, not a question.
Yeah.
I'm not an attorney. I do remember there was quite a bit of discussion back under hers about concerns of the legality of the committee, and actually some legal action was begun about it. I frankly cannot remember what happened, because basically we came out with a plan, and I think it just kind of got pushed aside. But I think she made a terrific mistake, which I think that she's learned from, but she made a huge mistake in the way that going about that committee. First and foremost, it was a completely Democratic committee in terms of members from Congress. There were no Republicans on it. I just still shake my head about that. I can't. You had very, very good senators and some very good House members who were knowledgeable about the issue and who wanted to see something happen positive. Bob Dole was one of them, and he ended up being he and Newt Gingrich were the two that helped really make sure that the plan was really killed. And I think if they'd taken a different tack towards them from the beginning, not necessarily Gingrich, but certainly Dole, who had been chair of the Senate Finance Committee. I mean, he's a smart man. He knows this stuff. That was a mistake. I think there was one medical doctor on the whole committee.
Wow.
So let's make all the AMA doctors mad from the get-go. And so those were kind of strategic. The size of it was ridiculous. And if that meant I wouldn't be on it, although, of course, our role was slightly different again, because the whole plan was set up for the states to run the system. States administer the system. So they had to have some reading on what the states could do. But regardless, it was unwieldy. It was well organized, I must say. It was, and for having so many moving parts, this toll gate process was a pretty interesting process for it to go through. But I just think some very fundamental strategic mistakes were made. And of course, smarter people than me have done analysis of what happened, but you know, you basically you spend $100 million in advertising against it, which is what the insurance industry did, and then you spend all of that money, and then you don't promise people that they're going to be better off. You know, they shook up the whole thing. And at that time, which I think is unlike, speaking to what you're talking about, I think it's different today. I think a much higher proportion of the people in America are unhappy, dissatisfied, financially strapped by, and scared about health care in a way that I don't think was really true to the same extent in 1993, 94. Because, you know, people might not have been completely happy with their health care, but they had it. You know, and for somebody to say, we're going to come in and we're going to do a whole new system, they did the, you know, the conservative thing, which is to be cautious. And you don't want to end up with something worse than what you have. I just think it's deteriorated so much now that many, many more people don't, or you know, feel like, what the heck? We've got to do something better. We can't afford this. When every paycheck is being eaten, any increases that people have gotten for a number of years now have been eaten completely by increases in healthcare costs. So,
Okay. Thank you. And one more question? Do you have any other questions?
come on.
One more. Would you consider that the insurance industry is really motivated to keep health prices going up so it can get more people into their insurance policies? Because like insurance industry has been a big part of the problem instead of being part of the solution for the people.
I think I would answer it in I wouldn't set up the construct of the question that way. I think there's a fundamental issue about what is insurance. And one school of thought is that insurance is where you get everybody in the same pool, and you all hold hands, and you all contribute, and you pray to God that you're not the one who needs it. You know, that's social insurance. And you can have insurance companies in that, but they don't have any motivation for trying to keep sick people out. Because if everybody's in, and if everybody is covered in a way that across the whole pool enough money is there for them, then the insurance industry, in current day incentives of trying to make sure that nobody gets in whoever really needs anything a whole lot, you know. And I personally cannot get health insurance. I mean, I spent 1 year, when I left the state, I spent a year after the COBRA ran out with no insurance. None. And the irony was just hysterically funny. I mean, you know, I couldn't, and it wasn't about money. It wasn't about money. They would not offer it to me. They wouldn't give it to me. So I ended up in kind of this high-risk thing to do for a while. But I mean, so there can be, you can have a system with insurance companies that play roles of bill paying and, you know, maybe competition, or perhaps trying to do healthy lifestyle type incentives for people. And, you know, in South Africa, you get free movie tickets if you sign up with this particular, you know, health plan, and you go to work out once a week at this particular gym. Then you get a free movie ticket every month. I mean, you know, there are all kinds of creative. I'm not against the private sector having creative roles, which I think that, you know, can come. But there's that fundamental first question, which is everybody in or is everybody not in? And does everybody have access to it? And I also think you can't control prices until then. You just can't. You really can't control costs. As long as you have a quarter of the people out there who can walk into your emergency room. So, and frankly, you know, have to, because they don't have other places they can get in. So I hope that kind of answered your question. But I think the current role of the private insurance industry right now is counterproductive to trying to get control of costs. I don't see how we can. They will continue to go up.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Before we- give you a small token of appreciation.
I hope it's not too small.
I don't know. If you need a small one, let me know.
No, that's good. That's fine. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
DeAnn.
bye-bye.